Welcome to 2017. I'm going to focus on Cliff High's work today. So Cliff High, he does something called a WebBot report, and I recommend checking it out if you have $15. It's half past human. I don't get anything for this. He's an interesting guy. I would first probably look into some of his other information on the internet, because he does have a lot of that, and see if you think there's any legitimacy to what he has to say. I'm going to talk about him today, and hopefully you find it interesting. So half past human, you can find that report. So this notion of a WebBot roughly is it's a predictive algorithm that he has created. So it scours the internet for different kinds of phraseology, and he believes to some degree that there's humans have latent psychic capacities to kind of predict into the future. Whether or not he's right, it's been very eerily accurate, uncannily accurate, perhaps even in the last couple months. I think didn't have as many hits earlier because he's been doing this for a number of years, but he isn't a small-time person. He worked for Microsoft and a few of those other big companies, so there's elements of respect, I suppose, he's had in his life. Anyways, looking into his most recent report, I think it's called Science Fiction or something like that, sci-fi, something like that, and very strange reports in some respects. He does a section called Deep Woo or something like that, Space Goes Farts, I think is what he calls it. And roughly speaking, it delves into things about like Antarctica having UFO ties and so forth. I won't focus on that too much, nor his theology, which I don't necessarily agree with too much, but he has fascinating ideas about economy, geopolitical, and that other stuff is fascinating too, don't get me wrong. I'm going to try to approach it a little bit from a value systems perspective, so hopefully I can add some enhancements to what has been talked about on the web thus far. That's kind of the primary focus here. Is I'm going to use a lens called spiral dynamics. Look it up. I'll briefly give a super brief overview of it, which we can then use as a reference to some of the stuff that he seems to be predicting. So spiral dynamics is a notion of value system development. It takes into account biological, sociological, and psychological conditions, and it points to this idea in which humans are in a never-ending quest for different kinds of meaning and valuing in existence. And once we've kind of reached the end of one quest, we go on to a new one. And as technology advances, simultaneously, we tend to have psychological mutations in consciousness. The very basic one, and you might even merge it with animal kind of consciousness, arguably started around 100,000 years ago, although some of this stuff is open to question, especially if new science emerges. But using more traditional science, the idea was that we were hunting and gatherers, roughly speaking, or even before that, foragers, actually. And we quest for fire and these sorts of basic survival-oriented, sexual-oriented kind of lifestyles. As we moved forward to 50,000 years ago, shamanism and so forth came in. This is kind of magical consciousness, and if you dance, it'll rain. If you wear an animal suit, you might imbibe the intelligence and the kinds of wisdoms of that animal. And voodoo curses, we see this in, say, Haiti sometimes now. So that's, there's still ever-presence of these values to some extent throughout our culture, but the primary focus has shifted dramatically over the last period of time. And so as we move forward, 10,000 years ago, we get sort of power gods. You see this in kind of the Mayan culture, the Egyptian culture, and so forth. And ritual sacrifice, might is right. The king of the jungle, ruthlessness. You see in gang culture now, largely speaking, kind of that the strong man kind of thing. As we move forward into the great mythical traditions, so we start to see this 5-ish thousand years ago, arguably. We get the great religious traditions around the world. All of them have this kind of mythos, a sort of holy book in which we are to take absolute as the truth. And so we look for purpose primarily in this worldview, sort of look up to God, miraculousness, and so forth. We still see this today in sort of, in a very positive way in some of the cops and so forth, the rule keepers that actually honestly do want to keep law in society. And there's, I think, a very beautiful side of it and a shady side of it too, but, important step from the impulsive element of the power gods that would sacrifice you, literally kill you to gain more power. And there's still some of that in, us and them in religious traditions. If you're not part of us, our group, then you are a heathen and you can be killed and so forth. So there's a shadow to that too. And then as we move into the 17th century thereabouts, we see the Enlightenment period. Skepticism, questioning, as long as it's within the scientific paradigm itself. As long as you believe in science, you can question things, roughly speaking. That is to say, if it's logical, etc. We see this in industrialization, the conveyor belt, step 1, step 2. We see it in grade school, step 1, step 2. By the end, you should be a fully reasonable person, so long as you have a logical structuring of that school system. However, now we don't see that as much. Since the 1950s, we've moved into a different system, the pluralistic system, roughly speaking, multiculturalism, relativism, kind of that Einsteinian relativism and stuff like that. And this opens a doorway to say that you can't be an absolute observer, as science sort of presupposes. You are not empirically or objectively infallible. Your perceptions have flaws. Your way of looking at the world is not perfect. So therefore it opens the door to everybody having sort of equal kind of ability to view the world, or at least more or less, so long as you believe in the system of pluralism itself. So there's a bit of a catch-22 in there that it sort of hangs up on a bit. What I think we're moving into, and this is why I bring this up, is, Cliff High is pointing to this notion of sort of economic, geopolitical chaos, etc. And I think, the spiral dynamics model has this notion of 6-on-6 pattern, roughly speaking. So there's these 6 major stages, and then the next tier, they call it, and it's a monumental leap in meaning. There's kind of a fractal that goes on here. And the first system of the next tier, which is that monumental leap, has relationships to that beige system. So the first system of the human species in some sense. And it kind of was oriented towards survival, but now it's kind of survival on a global level. So these people can, to some degree, take into account all the different perspectives that are emerged up to this point. So they have an ability to be sort of a psychological chameleon, in that they can take into their way of being, say, the blue system, if that's what's needed. So you go walk into the church and, you are legitimately trying to be part of the body of that communion in some important sense. Even if you don't believe in the absolute protocols of it, you are still sharing space with them in some important sense. But so what we see with Cliff's predictions, so Cliff is arguing by example, probably July of this upcoming year, we're going to be in a lot of tumult if he's right. So he's saying get prepared in some important respects, financially if you can, trying to get a bit of gold and silver. I focus more on silver myself, and then things like cryptocurrencies. He focuses on Bitcoin. I've been focusing more on something called Ethereum. He might be making the right bet there with Bitcoin. It seems to be becoming the new gold in some important sense. Gold is kind of an ancient relic, although it understandably in times of chaos holds some important value because it's been historically a great system of wealth maintenance, right? You could buy a nice sort of cloak and slippers and a good meal and so forth 2,000 years ago with an ounce of silver, and you can do that maybe a little bit better now. So it's held its value very well, whereas you look at the fiat dollar, you know, it's 2% of what it was in 1913 or even less. So dramatic loss in value in essence. So he's saying prepare on that front and keep aware of some of these big geopolitical trends that are taking place right now. The bond market's going to go wild, and it has been starting to go wild. And, you know, we see trying to get connected with people. I'm a big fan of gardening in some sense. You know, in the 1940s, during World War II, there was this notion of victory gardens. And it's important to note, too, I've mentioned this before, but seeds per ounce were worth in certain areas more than gold. So they're a great store of value. Heirloom seeds in particular, if you are looking for a cheap something as a store of value, that might be your absolute best bet, in my opinion, having a few thousand of those seeds. Especially if you only have $20 or something like that. So he's saying that this woo stuff is going to come into play as well. And, you know, we're going to see, for example, things about aliens and whatnot emerge. Things about, you know, and it's interesting, even just taking into account his prediction system. If he actually gets some of this stuff right over the next few months, which has seemingly been pretty uncanny the last couple months, if it continues for another few months, people might be seriously taking into consideration even the nature of being psychic and so forth, in my opinion, because of the uncanny nature of it. You know, you can kind of explain it away as just people people predict things, right? We all do it. And so in the crypto world, there's something called reputation coins. I'm kind of rambling, but this is kind of interesting. So reps, or Augur, is a system that's kind of like Minority Report, where people are using prediction algorithms to create consensus on what's going to happen in the future. And there's been some studies that seem to show that, on the whole, people guessing sort of, say, a number of jelly beans in a jar, the group of people guessing it get more accurate predictions than one individual. So in that sense, the idea there is that the people that maybe aren't psychic so much as just the group averages more accuracy than a single individual. And then so he's contabulating the group effort on the future instead of just looking at one individual that's going to get certain things really right, certain things really wrong. And so the average, the mean, gets it more right more often. That's kind of the idea there. So there is reason to still question the nature of this suggestion that people are psychic, even if he does get a lot more accuracy in the near term. Anyway, he's saying it's going to be a wild ride in the next year. Uprisings, things like that could be very possible. So try to build strong family, friend relationships, get stable with, if you can, work, economy, or your finances, food stuff, things like that. I don't like to be fearmonger, but to me it seems very possible. So, be well.